Hey everyone, welcome to Washington Heights and welcome to those watching online.
And also welcome to those from Weber County Jail. We're so excited that you're joining us.
Way excited.
I'm Pastor Mike.
I'm Pastor Jimmy, and we're excited you're here. Hey, hopefully everyone got a bulletin coming in or a program. In that program is a connection card. What do we do with this, Mike?
Fill it out.
Fill it out. Why do we fill it out?
I have no idea.
I know. We'd like to hear from you. We really want to hear from you. It's a new year, too. So what we want to do is get the most of these in this year, this Sunday. So please take a moment, fill it out. They got some boxes to check.
And it's such a great way for us to be able to connect with you, to know what's going on in your life. And so if you've got a prayer request or something going on in your life that you want to let us know about, you can put that on there as well.
So once again, take a moment, fill it out. As the offering goes by at the end, please drop it in. And then we will get back to you if you've checked anything. We just want to hear from you. We really do. Hey, also, if you're new today, we've got a book for you.
It's a little gift from us to you just to say thanks for being here. It's called How Good is Good Enough. Simple read, gives a little snapshot into sort of what we believe here in Washington Heights Church.
It's a really good gift. As you exit our building, you'll see some tables. On those tables are these books. So if you're new, your first time here, you've been here a couple Sundays and really haven't connected, please feel free to grab one of these on your way out. It's our way of saying, hey, thanks for being with us. Hey, we're starting a whole new series this brand new year. What is it? Do you know?
That's right. We're starting a new series called Be Happy, and it's a look at some of the teachings of Jesus on what it truly means to be happy. And oftentimes we'll find that it's not what we think it is.
You know, some of those Beatitudes really teach on the principles on how to live.
What are some of the Beatitudes?
Well, I remember reading one that says, blessed are those who have long hair because they'll have great faith.
Well, blessed are those who are bald
because why?
Bald is beautiful.
No, it's long hair. I haven't cut my hair for like years, man.
Yeah, but I'm bald,
so. It's really good. I think those are one of the Beatitudes. I mean, it's okay. We still love you, buddy. Yes. We still love you. We still love you. You know, another Beatitude I got are, blessed are those who are comfortable with how God made them.
I'm uncomfortable.
Because they will inherit friends. You know, Roy gave me this shirt. What do you guys think? It's a great shirt. He told me to advertise the church. Look at it. It's a good shirt. Yep, it's about my size, you know. They didn't have an extra small, so I took the small. So I think it looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. Blessed are those.
So grab an invite card, invite somebody to come join us this series on what it means to be happy. Get a shirt that actually fits appropriately, and let's hear what Roy has to say about what the real Beatitudes are.
Okay.
We're launching a brand new series called... I totally lost it. We're taking a look at some of the things that Jesus taught that aren't. So today, whoa.
Blessed are those.
Yes, you should just leave it like that.
Just leave it. Okay. That's it. That was actually.
Please pray for me. I have to work with this crew, you know. Actually, I am so thankful for the people I get to work with. And, you know, when I'm not here, it is so great to know that things are in good hands. And so Jimmy and Mike and Matt and Tammy and so many others, it truly is a privilege for me to be a part of that. Glad that you're here today. And, you know, when I came in early this morning, I already had some Seattle Seahawks fans tell me that, you know, don't bring up the Cowboy-Seahawks playoff game that happened last night. So I'm going to honor that request and not bring up the Cowboy-Seahawks playoff game, okay? And, you know, I won't mention that it was the Cowboys' third, you know, playoff victory in 23 years, and they won in dramatic fashion, and now it's on to another game while the Seahawks go home. I'm just going to leave that there and not bring that up one bit. So we are starting a new series today, as you already heard, called Be Happy, and we're going to be looking at a section of the beginning of what is often referred to as a Sermon on the Mount. So this is going to be Jesus as he launches into the greatest sermon ever preached, and it's the greatest because Jesus gave it. And right up front, he launches into this idea of being blessed, of being happy, of being favored. And often I think, you know, if we ask this question and we said, what is it that makes you happy? we would most likely think in direction that takes us outside of ourselves, that we would attach that to circumstances that happen around us, and if things around me are going right, well, then things in me will be good. I'll even be happy. In fact, our word happiness comes from an older English word called happenstance, and that is tied to circumstance, and so we might be inclined to think, well, yeah, the way that it happens is if everything around me is good, then everything in me will be okay. And Jesus is going to flip that idea on its head. But I even, was wondering, because we just went through a season called Christmas where we buy gifts for one another, and we do that as expressions of our love and encouragement and appreciation for the people in our lives. And I thought, well, what were the most common Christmas gifts? And as you can imagine, it was electronics and game systems and all those kind of things. But then I saw something else that said some of the more unusual, popular Christmas gifts this last year. And let me just give you a glimpse of some of them. What makes you happy? This is a shower curtain of a unicorn cat. If you have this in your house, we need to talk. We need to get you some help, all right? If you gave this to somebody, we need to get you some help. How that is one of the most common, I don't know. Here's another one. You could drink out of the teeth mug. Dentists having a great time there, grossing us all out with drinking your coffee or whatever out of the teeth mug. For guys, I saw this and I thought, oh yeah, a flamethrower. Boys have this fascination with fire that begins to wind down at about age 95, 96, 97, somewhere in there. But until then, that's really cool. And I thought, how did I not know this, that I could put this on my list? But that's a bit much to store. They actually have one that is a smaller version that you can just have on your wrist. I'm thinking, yes. Guys, get your list started early for this coming year. We often think that if things go right, the right things come into my life, whether it be relationally, financially, gift-wise, whatever it might be, it will be well with me. But Jesus is going to take us in a different direction. He's going to talk a lot about how God blesses certain people. And that word there that we're going to see over and over again, it's a complex, rich word that doesn't just mean one singular thing. And I hope you know the Bible was not originally written in the English language. The New Testament was written in the Greek language. And sometimes translating is a bit of a challenge. And it has this idea of happy, fortunate, or favored. And many translations will actually say, happy are those. We're going to see God blesses those. And it's going to give us all these different descriptions of what that looks like. And I'll just tell you before we look at them, it's going to sound counterintuitive. It's not going to sound the way that we would likely think it should sound when we're talking about being happy, being fortunate, being favored. So what did Jesus actually say? Let's take a look at this as Matthew chapter 5. One day as Jesus, saw the crowds gathering, Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples gathered around him, and he began to teach them. God blesses those who are poor, and actually in the Greek it says poor in spirit, and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you are my followers. Be happy about it. Be very glad, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. Now here's my guess. I think, as we read through that and we just think about life and how it plays out, we think, that just doesn't sound right. You know, it sounds like Jesus is talking about difficult things, and how can that be happy, favored, blessed? How does that work? Well, here's something that we need to say based on what Jesus says right up front. Remember the question, what makes you happy? And we would be tempted to think about something or maybe someone or some circumstance outside of ourselves that if it would go right and would be a part of our lives, all would be well. Based on what Jesus said, you know what makes us happy? Nothing. No thing makes us happy. That it isn't tied to circumstance, but what Jesus talks about is something that happens inside of us, that happiness, favored, is something that begins on the inside and works its way out, not something on the outside that works its way in. It is not tied to circumstance. That is something that happens inside of any heart or life that follows in the direction that Jesus takes us. Jesus tells us, you know, happiness is an inside job, that it begins inside of the heart and the soul of any person who goes in the direction that Jesus invited us to go. So each week what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at two of those statements, two of those Beatitudes, try to unpack them and understand them and apply what they mean to us. And so the first one that Jesus says, God blesses the poor in spirit. What does that mean? It means to humbly depend on God and not myself. In whatever place in life we might find ourselves, that we would be dependent on Him, recognizing every day, every moment, no matter what it is, that I'm dependent upon Him, that I need Him, that there is this spiritual poverty, this spiritual emptiness, this spiritual brokenness inside of myself, that when it comes to especially being right with God and doing and experiencing all that He has for us, I can't do that on my own. That I need God. So in my job, in my relationships, in my family, in just who I am day to day, there needs to be this humble dependence on God being involved in our lives and giving us direction for it. Then secondly, he says, God blesses those who mourn, and we think, man, if the first one sounded strange and counterintuitive, this one seems even worse. How can you mourn and be happy at the same time? But what he's talking about with mourning is a sense of ownership of the sin that lives in our lives, the junk that makes up our lives. And I think in our day that's a real challenge, because it's real easy to always find someone or something to blame for whatever it is that we're wrestling with, struggling with. But Jesus invites us to say, hey, first, recognize, spiritually speaking, I got nothing. And then beyond that, that there is this need inside of me to recognize how far I have to go and maybe how far I've fallen, and to take ownership, responsibility for that. And that in that moment, that's the starting point. That's where happiness begins, when there is just this honest recognition of what's going on inside of here. That's one thing for us to talk about that and understand that, but what does that really look like? What would that look like in real life? Well, one day Jesus tells a story, a parable. Parables are made-up stories meant to illustrate a spiritual truth. And Jesus tells a story that I think in so many ways illustrates exactly what he was talking about here at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And I hope and I pray that this story can help us understand, okay, now I get how this has something to do with somebody like me. This is found in Luke chapter 18. Then Jesus told this story to some who had great confidence in their own righteousness and scorned everyone else. So Jesus has a purpose with this story. He's not just telling it just to say a story. But there were people who were looking at themselves, that when they think about a relationship with them and God and where they stand and how it works out in this world, they were thinking, I'm doing great. And so when it comes to that, I don't have a whole lot of needs outside of myself. My life is going great. My heart is doing great. I'm good. But there's something else that came along with it, right? There would be the opportunity to think, not only am I doing good, but you and you and you, you're not doing so good. And so Jesus tells a story that aims at that whole mindset. Two men went to the temple to pray. It's a good thing. Go to a place of worship, pray, which is, a way that we can dialogue and connect with God. One was a Pharisee and the other was a despised tax collector. Now, if you know anything about the life and the times of Jesus in this world, you know that Jesus had this running conflict with the Pharisees, and Jesus had a habit of turning the tables. And many times when you see Pharisee, if you've been around church for a while, you know, cue the ominous music, dun, 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 a Pharisee. And then you see a tax collector, somebody who, as it's described here, despised. And that's not hyperbole. That's not an exaggeration. Tax collectors were viewed as the worst of the worst, and here's why. Because in that day, the nation of Israel was under the thumb of the Roman Empire, and life was not good and life was not easy, and one of the things that Rome did from all of the people that it conquered was to exact a tax from them. To fund an empire and to fund a Roman legion is not a cheap undertaking, and so they needed resources for that, so they would take it out of the people that they've conquered. And in each region, each community, they would sell off the right to be a tax collector that would be sent to Rome to the highest bidder. And they would choose from the people in that community. And so from amongst their own, somebody would take the tax that would fund the Roman army that was enslaving the people right in that community. And so they were viewed as being sellouts, traitors. But there's more to it even than that. Because Rome said, you know what, here's the tax that we require of you, and that would vary from time to time. Whatever you can get above and beyond that, you're free to keep it. And many of the tax collectors found, boy, I can add a lot on top of what Rome wants and get pretty wealthy off of this. So not only were they viewed as being traitors, they were extortionists, taking from their own people. And so imagine what it was like to see one of those people in your communities who was taking from you to give to the enemy, to fund more enslavement, and they were getting pretty wealthy off it. You contrast that with a Pharisee who was somebody seriously committed to the commandments of God in the Old Testament. And their whole life was structured around it. And so you have this dramatic difference between these two. And in that day, a Pharisee was viewed that, hey, if this is a classroom, they're the honor students. They are going above and beyond and doing all kinds of extra work to gain favor in their community and also with God. And so Jesus puts those two people there as a target of this story. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed this prayer. I thank you, God, that I am not a sinner like everyone else. For I don't cheat, I don't sin, and I don't commit adultery. Now, those are all good things. What that meant was that if he was in business, he wasn't taking advantage of anybody. He didn't pad his expenses, or misrepresent things. Whatever the cost was, that was the cost. And it meant that his word was his bond, and if he said it, you could trust him that he was going to keep his word. And in a day that was as sexually loose as our day, he wasn't straying down any of the other roads that he could have. Those are all good things he's doing. But I think we already noticed there's something else coming along with it, right? And there's something inside of his heart that looks at all of his good things, but then there's this contrast between him and other people that's happening. And it would be so easy for us, to think, yeah, you know what God's calling us to do? He's just calling us, don't do this and don't do that. This is the poster child for that person. But Jesus is taking us somewhere deeper than that. I'm certainly not like that tax collector. And he singles out the guy who would be on the farthest extreme away from him. I fast twice a week, and to us that doesn't mean a whole lot. Fasting is a practice of going without food for a period of time to be able to focus on God. In the Old Testament, there was really one requirement. Fast one time a year on the Day of Atonement. That's the day a high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and would make a sacrifice on behalf of all the people. and people were asked to kind of cease and desist from their normal food and meals on that day to be able to focus more on what was happening in that place. And so one day, once a year, he goes, I do it twice a week. Again, it's a good practice. And I give you a tenth of my income. So he's a tither. A tithe means to give a tenth. And, tithing was a pretty common practice back then. So what he's really doing is really taking us in the direction of saying, I go above and beyond what everybody else does in their normal giving. I give, in areas that people don't even consider when it comes to giving to God. And so again, he's looking very favorably at his virtues. But at the same time, he's got an eye on other people's vices. But the tax collector stood at a distance and dared not even lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. The normal custom was to look to heaven when you prayed to God. But his head is down. Instead, he beat his chest in sorrow, saying, "Oh God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner." And we may think, well, yeah, a tax collector should feel that way. Because after all, look at who he is and look at what he does, and hopefully he's come to the end of himself to recognize that he should change his ways and not be doing what he's doing. But there is more going on in this story. We might think, yeah, the Pharisee is conceited, and now the tax collector is beating himself up. But conceit, if we're looking at the spiritual condition of the heart, that's just acne of the heart. But what's going on in this story is more like the cancer of the heart that is at a much deeper, much more serious level. Conceit is a thing, and we don't like it, but it's not the same as the pride that lives in the Pharisee's heart. Heard this story about conceit. There's a woman who came to talk to her pastor. This did not happen at this church, not sure where it happened. And she said, Pastor, I have this recurring sin in my life. Every time I show up at church, I just know that I'm the prettiest woman there. Pastor looked at her and said, "Oh, no, that's not a recurring sin. That's just a horrible misperception on your part." See, conceit is one thing and we don't like it, but this is much more serious than that. It's somebody who stands in the presence of God and has one eye on his virtues, another eye on his neighbor's vices, and thinks that in the presence of God, what matters there are the petty differences that matter in our world, in our lives. So he's got one eye, a good one, on himself. He's got one eye, a bad one, on his neighbor. And he's got no eyes on God. I'm thinking, man, I'm doing great. And meanwhile, there's somebody else who comes in that same place and gets a picture of who God is and recognizes who he is. And this is the kind of story that is not meant to give us an easy checklist of, yeah, I would never do that. And how easy would it be to go, man, and I am so thankful that I'm not like that Pharisee. And if I ever do that, do you know who I've just become like? That Pharisee. Because that's what he was doing. And this story really is meant to tell us, you know what? No matter who you are, no matter how many good things make up your life, and they may well be good. That's awesome. But when it comes to who we are with God, everybody is in need of the same thing. And if I were to ask you to picture in your mind's eye, the person that you would think is the farthest away from God and all that is right and good, and then also picture yourself, myself, in comparison to that, the minute that I think, you know what? I have less need for God than that person, I've just entered that story. Because no matter who we are all in need of all of God's grace. What did Jesus say? Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. God blesses them. Those who recognize there's a spiritual poverty in here. And yeah, it's great that I'm doing all these great things, but that does not change the reality of myself. God blesses those who mourn who recognize the darkness that can live inside of their own hearts. And maybe there's less today than there was yesterday or last year or last decade, but it doesn't change the need that I have in reference to God, a holy and righteous God, to own the darkness that can live in me. And so Jesus takes us away from this idea that says, yeah, I know I need a little bit of grace, but I need less grace than that guy and that gal. No, we all need the same thing. Here's how Jesus concludes that story. I tell you, the sinner, not the Pharisee, returned home justified before God. Why? For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. But how easy it is in the human experience to think that somehow our virtues, whatever they might be, and they're not made up. And I don't think the Pharisee in the story was making this stuff up. It wasn't about him being a liar. But they can lead us in the direction of thinking that, you know what, I'm doing good. Got it. It's under control. Every day, every moment, no matter who we are. We got to recognize I'm poor in spirit. And that's not making ourselves a spiritual doormat. It's acknowledging and recognizing the truth. That I've got to take ownership of my sin, my junk. Not to beat myself up, but healing begins where truth begins. And it's acknowledging the truth about myself. And this tax collector, I think he illustrates something for us, that when you see God, you see yourself. And when you see the righteousness and holiness of God, all of a sudden, the picture of myself comes more into a rightful clarity, a truthful picture. And when you see yourself, you see your sin. And when we see our sin, we see our need. And when we see our need, those are the moments in which we seek God's grace. And that is exactly the right place to be. And that's where it begins. That's where these hearts of ours get transformed. I think the applications of what we're talking about, there are many of them. You know, every Tuesday night, something happens here at Washington Heights called Celebrate Recovery. It happens in the theater area out through those doors over there. And it is a Christ-centered recovery program that's not just about addiction. It's about hurts and habits and hang-ups and all of that. Not just with, substances, but also with just some of the relational stuff and just some of the internal stuff that we can wrestle with. And I believe that what Jesus said on that day has become a part of that program. Let me tell you the first two steps that are part of Celebrate Recovery. Step number one, realize I'm not God. I admit that I am powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong thing and that my life is unmanageable. God blesses those who are poor in spirit, who recognize, you know what? I can't always keep it together, even on my best day. That there is a brokenness, a spiritual poverty in here. I need divine intervention to transform this heart of mine. Step number two, earnestly believe that God exists, that I matter to Him, and that He has the power to help me recover. God blesses those who mourn, those who take ownership and recognize, you know what? I got some things to work on, some things to change. And in that place, coming with that mindset and with that heart, there's a God who is willing and able to work to transform me. I want to show you by way of video another example of it. You're going to hear from a lady named Debbie who's a part of this church. And her story is difficult. What happened around her and also what was going on within her. But all that changed so much for the better. And so much in line with what Jesus talked about on that day. Can we be happy even when the circumstances around us are not what we would desire, not what we want? And I think Debbie's story is going to tell us, yeah, we can. It's not always easy, but we can. Check out this video.
Debbie writes, 18 months ago, I went through recovery.
I found God, and I want to prove my love or show my love for Him.
I chose to put my hope and faith into God because 8 years ago, I had a child that passed away. I found myself lost and in a really dark place. I was overcome by addiction. I was contemplating suicide because I knew my life had become so bad that I was either going to die or spend the rest of my life in jail. And 2 years ago, I surrendered myself to God. And I know it was God that intervened that day, or I wouldn't be here. I went to a recovery house and I got sober. And had it not been for God's love, I don't know where my life would be today. But I know that because of God's love and my willingness to surrender myself to Him, for Him to put me on that path that I needed to be on, changed my life. Now I have a healthy, happy, sober life now. And I get to live that with my family by my side each and every day.
And so, Debbie, have you come to the place you put hope and trust in Jesus alone to save you?
Yes, I have.
And Debbie, based upon the profession of your faith, going to baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And you heard her use the word happy, right? But the circumstances didn't change. She's still a mother without a child. That's never good. But how can there be happiness? How can there be a sense of being favored? Where does that begin? God blesses those who are poor in spirit, who recognize the need that they have to be dependent upon God every moment, every day. God blesses those who mourn, who take ownership and responsibility for their sin, for their stuff. That's where it begins. And it calls us and invites us to be humble. How do you become humble? You don't make yourself a spiritual doormat. You certainly don't look at the people around you and try to draw comparisons of how you're doing compared to them. No, when we look at God and we see who He really is, we get an accurate picture of who we are, broken and yet loved by the God who came to rescue us, to save us, to transform us, to invite us to be a part of His family, to be adopted by His grace, His love, and His power. That's where it begins. And that's available to anyone. And if we think, you know what, I think I can identify with that tax collector. So far off, I think I blew it so many times in so many ways. The whole point of Jesus' story is, no, you haven't. Because everybody needs the same thing. And it is available to you. I'm going to invite you to bow your heads together with me as I pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for your grace to us, your undeserved favor. And God, forgive us in those moments when we get an inaccurate picture of ourselves and we think, I don't need you. Or maybe a little bit, but not a lot. God, help us to know that we need to be dependent upon you always. And in that place, we find what our hearts are searching for, but it's not found inside of us, it is found with you. And so take us in that direction. And thank you for your grace that forgives us. And you begin to go to work to transform us, to make us whole. And thank you for the assurance that we can have a relationship with you here and now in the life that you came to bring and the eternal life that extends beyond even this world. So we thank you for your goodness to us and help us to walk in that journey together with you where you make us over into the image of the one we've come to honor and worship today, in the image of Jesus. And we ask and pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.